Temptation. What is temptation to lust and how to overcome it? I looked up the definition in Oxford Languages Dictionary and said that temptation is the desire to do something, especially something wrong or unwise. That is quite clear. I like the itch. It's a very good example, illustration of what temptation is like an itch. It comes from a Latin word, temptare, which means to handle, test, to try. As we go through the explanation, you will see why I highlighted this, but it's something to keep in mind. Although these explanations are not biblical, biblical explanation comes from Thomas Tarrants. I don't know if I pronounce his surname right, but he is working in C.S. Lewis Institute, and he said that temptation to sin has been universal throughout human history. No one has ever been exempt from it or from the consequences of yielding to it. In the Bible, and this is the important part, temptation is an enticement to act in disobedience to God's will. Its sources are the world, the flesh, and the devil. So, when we act, so this is God's will. This circle represents God's will. So if we act somewhere here, we do an action here, it is sin. And if we do an action here, this is within God's will, and this is a righteous action to do. So when we are tempted to leave the circle and to do sin, that is temptation, that itch. And why? When I speak to people who are not believers, and they have this preconceived notion that what is sin is fun and what is not sin is usually boring. So God is restricting us. But when you really think about it, God knows how He created us. Only He knows. So everything that we do within the circle of God's will is healthy. And whatever we do outside of God's will is unhealthy. And I like to define sin as damage. That's a big one. So sin equals damage. It's not perfect. It's not perfect, but it always helps me to think and to explain to non-believers, especially. When I was studying lust and temptations, actually most of the theory that I got came from these two verses, were mostly just from one. And it's in James 1, 14 and 15. Oops, I wasn't supposed to show that. I'm still getting adjusted to this tool. So each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. Desire comes up again. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. That's why it's unhealthy. Well, when we are sick, it's kind of a small death. So when we act in this, we sow death. It's unhealthy. We get so much unhealthiness that we perish. So each person, this shows the universality of temptation. Each person is tempted. If you live with this body, well, it's just me with this hand, but if you live in this type of flesh, you are being tempted. Even Jesus was tempted, yet he did not sin. So we're speaking about temptation. He is lured and enticed. So lure is like when you fish, you have a lure. You have something good that the fish wants. So you can lure and take the fish for your own benefit. And enticed is a draw by his own desire. If you don't want to smack someone, you don't have a desire. But if I want you to smack someone, this is my desire. I could share it with you in a way and convince you by maybe saying that, oh, that person did something really bad and he said something really bad about you. But that desire to that comes to temptation has to come from you. So it's an inner reality. Jesus said every sexual immorality comes from the heart. So temptation, to summarize, is a desire to cause damage. And damages could be a lot of different types. It could be relational, it could be physical. Um, so everything that we do outside of God's bounds of His will causes damage, because God created us not for sin but for Himself. That's why He gave us laws, so we get to be in that perfect circle of His will, which is healthy, and that gives us life. And since temptation is a desire to cause damage, how do we overcome the temptation, which is this damaging desire? So, since desire is mentioned so much, I want to think about it a little bit more. What is desire? So, according to the dictionary, a desire is a strong feeling of wanting to have something or wishing for something to happen. Or it could be a strong sexual feeling or appetite, and this is where we get lust. But not every desire is bad, and not every desire is good. There are desires of the flesh that are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit that are against the flesh. And they are opposed to each other. So let's come back to James 1. Each person is tempted when he is lured, like I said, offering some form of reward, and enticed, attracted or tempted by offering pleasure in an advantage. And I'm moving towards this. Lured and enticed by his own desire. But when we look at our lives, nothing really comes out of the blue. There's always a reason. And not really. I came up with this, but I made this chart from my studies, from everything that I'm looking into, why lust is what it is and why do we struggle with it. And I realized that everything almost in life starts with a thought. And when we have enough of thoughts, it creates a feeling. And then when we feel something, we decide, because we're not necessarily logical. We decide by feelings and we justify by logic, but we make decisions based on emotions and feelings. And when we decide, we do something. And then when we do something enough times, we create a habit. And a lot of habits create a character and eventually a destiny. And it's not always that simple, but there's a flow that can be tracked for most of the time. We rarely do the action itself. There's always a reason, especially when it comes to lust. We don't open a certain website because we just like the opening of a website just for the sake itself. We don't like the action for the action's sake. But what is causing us is the feeling. And this is where, and I didn't mention this, but desire, okay, it wants me to write there, but desire is part of feeling, because as we have established, it's a strong feeling of wanting to have something or wishing for something to happen. So when it comes to lust, we want a feeling and we do that action to get something. There's that lure to get some kind of reward. And what that reward is pleasure. And that's another feeling. There's a basic pleasure principle in psychology that we pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Our brains are wired in such a way that we want to pursue pleasure, maximize it, and minimize pain as much as we can, as much as it is possible. And to summarize or to make it simple, we've moved from two states. If we are in an undesired state, like for example, I'm hungry, we want to move to desired state. I'm full. I ate enough. I'm satisfied with food. And the same comes with lust. There are undesired states and desired states that you try to move to and from. Another small note is that when we stay in desired state, it gets boring. We start to experience pain. So that desired state starts to turn into undesired state. So for example, I ate lunch and after some time I get hungry again. My body used up the nutrients, my stomach is empty again, and I automatically, because of time, I'm placed in undesired state, and I have to move again to the desired state. So pleasure is the reward, and lust has its power as long as we feel pleasure. Imagine if you, I didn't think through this example, but it's a good one. When you were small, you probably watched cartoons because you found them pleasurable, you found them interesting, and it moved you from undesired state of boredom and you un- unrealized curiosity into a state that you desired, where you feel entertained. But when you grow up, those cartoons are they're not as interesting anymore. So their appeal lost its power. You no longer see cartoons as pleasurable anymore. It's the same with lust. So as long as you see lust as pleasurable, it has its power to tempt you, to create a desire to give you pleasure. Now, does it actually give pleasure? It's you probably know that is not true. It is something here, or probably maybe further, but it appears like it gives you pleasure. It's like a mosquito itch. You want to scratch it, it feels kind of nice, but actually it gives you unhealthy results. When you scratch mosquito bite, it actually damages the skin, and it could cause infections. But with lust, it's basically every single time when you scratch that itch of a wrong desire. So why do we have desires? If you think about Adam and Eve, how did the snake tempted them? The serpent said to Eve that you will be like God and you'll know everything. I think it said you'll know everything. So the serpent showed what they lack. So desire starts when you realize you lack something. You wouldn't even know you're in undesired state if you didn't have the knowledge that you could be here. When you want to leave the state of have not and reach the state of have, desire is in action. I could have this. Oh, I want this. And then it creates a desire, a draw, a lure. And then you realize, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to move to desired state. Therefore, you take action. And to summarize it and to simplify it even more, we can say that there are states of pain and pleasure. So when we feel pain, we want to experience pleasure. And that's not necessarily wrong, because you could have a really strong desire to demonstrate love, and it's a godly thing. And you want to pray for someone in church because it causes you pain to know that someone is in pain that Jesus paid for. So you approach that person, whereas your undesired state is that you feel bad for the person, and you move to desired state by praying for that person. So this is not evil. You don't have to aim to remove pain or pleasure. Like, those feelings are not inherently wrong, but what the better question to ask is, do they make you content? And if we're speaking about lust, this is why it's so important, is that to ask, like, does it actually make you content, this movement from pain to pleasure? And then when pleasure becomes boring, dull, not interesting, then you need another pleasure. You need to increase the dosage or find something more exciting. And it's quite clear that no, this doesn't give contentment. But what's the answer? If you go back a few verses in James 1, you'll find the answer. This is very exciting. James wrote that count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. So trials is that test where I said, remember this Latin word that temptation came from. So count it all joy when you meet testing of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect, complete, lacking nothing. And I want to highlight these three things: perfect, complete, and lacking nothing. I don't want to get jumbled up with my own thought, but when we're not perfect, when we're not complete, when we lack things, we experience pain. And true pleasure that God wants, because Jesus said, I came that you may have joy and have it fully, and have it life in abundance. God's desire for us is that we are perfect, complete, and lacking nothing. So now you might ask, how does it all work? What are the mechanics of this? When you Now I'll have to make new things in these graphs, or I'll just delete some of these. When you move from pain to pleasure, most of the time, pain is as painful as it is because there is no meaning. Because when there is meaning, pain is not as painful. For example, when you start exercising after a long break, you start to feel sore. Your muscles are sore. But then after some time passes and you train your body, you train your muscles, that pain, another soreness, becomes meaningful because you know my muscles are growing. And slowly that pain becomes less painful. So meaning appears. And guess what? You counted joy when you experience pain when you're exercising. Why? Because there's meaning. Your exercises, your muscles are growing. Please don't open these things. I'm controlling with buttons, so sometimes I press the wrong one. But when in the midst of pain, when pain becomes meaningful, it becomes less painful and becomes more pleasurable. And if you train your body so much, you will notice that things that others would find like torture, you actually enjoy. For example, me cycling in the cold weather on a bad road in the dark. I enjoy it. It's fun. It's like a um, not adventure, because in Albanian adventure is a bad word in a way. It has something to do with lust, but it's like a journey. I can't find the word. So when pain is introduced, when meaning is introduced into pain, and as you continue with it, it starts to merge with pleasure. So why did James say count it all joy? Because every trial that you face, every temptation to move away from God's will, let's copy. So every temptation that you're facing to leave God's circle of God's will, the circle of God's will, and when you say no to it, why you say no to it? Because you want to be healthy. So you count it all joy because it trains you to be stronger, to be better, to be more godly. And it produces steadfastness, it produces patience. You become callous in a good way towards temptation. And then that patience, steadfastness, grows to a place where you feel perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. So I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, that sounds like something to be content about. And how do you grow in your contentment? Is when you count your pain as joy, meaning you find meaning in it. And if sometimes pain doesn't have meaning, it just is. But most of the time you can find meaning in pain. The greatest example of this is Jesus. We find it in Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2. It says that, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, and this is speaking about all the people that went before us, I hope it's big enough, who walked out faith through various kinds of trials and were patient with it, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. So he counted the cross. Of course, it's a trial. Of course, it was difficult. Of course, it was painful. But he saw the meaning in it. And because he saw the meaning in it, in the cross, he was able to endure it. His steadfastness grew from his um, manhood, despising the shame. So he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And now he's able to welcome us into the kingdom because of that pain, because of the meaning in that pain. Another bad example is Israelites when they left Egypt. Well, Egypt was painful. They were beaten up. They were slaves. It was difficult. And they prayed to God, God, please deliver us from this slavery. God came. Well, not he didn't came. He sent Moses, and Moses moved them from pain. Well, not necessarily. Maybe the desert wasn't as much of a pleasure, but it was still away from the slavery. But they didn't see that meaning. They started to see the desert as pain, and they said it was better for us in slavery because we could eat meat, we could eat bread. So they didn't see the meaning in their pain. So maybe pleasure also needs to have meaning. But once they stopped seeing the meaning in them being in the desert, it started to be pain, and they wanted to move kind of back into slavery. So God had to wait for another generation to be born who didn't know Egypt. So I will leave you with two questions. What pain you should consider as joy? There must be something in your life that you're going through and you really don't like it, but it's something that actually trains you in steadfastness. And although it seems like it's breaking you apart, it's actually building you up. So, what pain you should consider as joy and why?